we gathered together. Our purpose is not so much to have cookies and cake. It's more about advancing ourselves professionally.
This is perfect work for me. I always liked art. I always liked sewing. I liked math, and I liked writing, and this combines everything that I like to do. And in fact, I decided on a career in quilting by reading a career guidance book called What Color is Your Parachute? And I had decided when I was 29 that I'd better come up with a real job.
One of the great things about being a professional quilt teacher and traveling is that everywhere you go, you are influenced by what's going on in that area. And then you're the lucky one that gets to go sprinkle the fairy dust in another area.
Welcome to Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast. I'm your host, Janniken Smucker. We often think of quilters as hobbyists, typically women who like to stitch beautiful bed covers for use around the home, or to lovingly give to new babies, or maybe to show off at Quilt Guild meetings. But for centuries, alongside hobbyist quilters have existed professional quilters, those who find a way to earn money for their craft and even quit their so-called day jobs. Professionals in the world of quilts might teach quilt making, write books, make quilts on commission, design patterns or fabrics, long-arm quilt for others, or work as a spokesperson for companies that cater to quilt makers. And these pros have to find the right kind of balance to create a satisfying and sustainable career, to pay the bills while still making quilts. Going pro requires a big leap of faith, especially for younger quilters, like the ones we are featuring during Season 3 of Running Stitch. And today's guest has recently taken that leap. A few months ago, Zak Foster was still earning a living as a high school Spanish instructor, something he'd been doing for 18 years. But this fall, he made the leap to professional quilter, and in this interview, he will share with us his motivations for doing so, some of the ways he is marketing his services, and he'll tell us about the quilt he helped make that recently appeared on the red carpet at the Met Gala. Like other younger quilters that we are featuring during this season of Running Stitch, Zak brings his own methods and processes to the craft, innovating while drawing on centuries of tradition. Zak has been making quilts since 2010, specializing in memory and burial quilts, creating custom pieces by reusing fabrics and found cloth. He draws inspiration from the quilters of Gee's Bend, as well as the built environment near his home in New York City. Please visit our episode page for images and links to Zak's work. In addition to discussing his process and the, quote, professionalization of his craft, we will listen back to interview excerpts from the Quilt Alliance's QSOS Save Our Stories oral history collection with other quilters who have similarly contemplated going pro. Zak, welcome to Running Stitch.
Oh, Yannick, and I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be included in the younger set. I just turned 41, and so that doesn't happen often. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so happy birthday. I just turned 46 a couple weeks ago myself. So yeah, anything we can do to keep our youthful glow here. Today, I'd like to just start off asking you to tell us about how you began making quilts.
Oh, I'm actually about to come up on my 10-year anniversary of quilting, something I'm very excited about because I've always been an artist. I've always been a creative type, but I kind of bounced around from medium to medium. You know, I did drawing and painting and screen printing and lithograph, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And so the fact that I've been with textiles for 10 years feels like, I don't know, it feels like this is a long-term relationship now. And so I started back when my friends first began having kids, you know, when I wanted to have something nice, just not something I could just pull off the rack at a store, but something that might mean something to them, you know? And so I learned how to quilt, and I didn't have a lot of quilting in my background. My mom didn't quilt. My grandma sewed her own clothes, but there were no quilters. So I learned how to quilt just like a lot of folks learn anything, YouTube and Instagram and just Googling things when I couldn't figure it out. And so 10 years later, here I am.
That's pretty cool. I'm amazed about all of those resources that are available just, freely over YouTube and various social media and everything. That's great. What drew you to quilting?
Oh, the tradition, the lifeline through place and history, I think. Um, I think it's not coincidence that I started quilting after I moved away from home, which for me is North Carolina. I now live in New York and I've been in New York since 2008. And so coming from a state that for a long time was known for its textiles and then being away from that state, outside of that state, I feel like there was also a way of trying to create a connection between me and home. And quilts offered that connection.
Could you tell me, so I know that you're contemplating or you're in the midst of really a transition of quitting your day job and beginning to make quilts more as your full-time career. But first, before we talk about that transition entirely, tell me sort of how you realized you could begin to make some money, not to just sound completely crass about quilt making, but when did you realize that that was part of something that was feasible, that you could start to make some money off your quilts, in addition to it just being a hobby / passion artistic
Yeah.
outlet?
Well, I I don't really know my exact timeline here to tell you, but if I've been quilting for 10 years, I probably opened up my Etsy shop. I started my Instagram account right away, and then I opened up an Etsy shop maybe year two, and thought I'd make a little pocket change that way. And it really was pocket change. I remember I made I made a king size quilt for somebody for $400, and at the time it felt like big money to me. But now I look back, I'm like, oh my God, Zachary, what are you doing? At some point, this has been year five, maybe, I did a Kickstarter campaign to raise money for a long arm quilting machine. And that went over really, really well. So I got the money I needed for the machine itself, but also on top because people were just so excited to support me in this new venture. And even at that point, though, it was still just going to be a side gig. But it gave me enough money for the long arm. It gave me enough money for a nice website to get that hosted, to get that designed. And slowly but surely, I began doing business through the shop on my website. And I'm glad I did because now, year 9, 10, almost all my business goes through my website. Very little goes through Etsy. I keep Etsy open just because it's such a nice exposure platform. So, I keep my foot in that door. I don't spend a lot of energy on it. I spend most of my time on my own site and then with this creative community, the Quilty Nook that we can talk about in a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Um, but Etsy for me is just kind of a back burner and placeholder business wise.
Let's listen back to an interview with Pepper Corey, a professional quilt maker who, in her 2001 interview conducted by Frances Jo Greenlaw at the International Quilt Festival in Houston, describes the way she pieces together a living as a pro.
So you are a professional quilter. This is
I
a
guess so.
livelihood for you.
Yes, but like most professional quilters, it's the rare bird who can actually make quilts and sell them and live on the proceeds of those sales. What I do is I make quilts, I write books, I write magazine articles, I design fabric, I design quilting stencils and painting stencils. But from all of that, I can make a living. But it's pennies on the dollar kind of living. The last quilt I sold, which was years ago, probably 12 years ago, was to a company. I did a sample for them, and I put way too much into it, way too much time, way too much effort. And when I sent them the bill for $600, they just about broke. And that's the last quilt I've ever sold because obviously there's a big disconnect between what people will pay for a quilt and what we know as quilt makers quilts are worth. So I would sooner give away a quilt than sell a quilt.
So Pepper is talking about how in order to be a professional, she couldn't just make quilts and sell them. She, became this sort of full-fledged quilt entrepreneur. So how do you sort of envision your professional life as a quilt maker? Do you plan to sort of reach out into these peripheral quilt entrepreneurship angles?
Oof. It is. I think of things like an income pie, and I'm thankful to say that I'm selling more quilts than I mean, it's been less than 12 years since I've sold a quilt. I'll tell you that. I would say quilting makes up probably about half of my income, and the other half comes from the Quilting Nook creative community. And what I like about that, I think often Luke Haynes and I had a conversation once. He says, Zach, when it comes to going full time, you got to realize you'll never sell quilts to quilters. And it sounds self-evident, right? But it's true. As much as we love quilting, everybody we're talking to on Instagram and social media are quilters, and so the chances are they're not going to buy a quilt. So you got to come up with something else. The people I sell quilts to, for the most part, are folks who want memory quilts or burial quilts or funeral quilts. I'm happy to talk about any of those. And so they're people who have some intrinsic understanding of the value of a quilt and what makes the quilt they want such a unique and significant item for them. And so they're willing to pay the labor that would go into that. I will often have kind of a sliding scale for memory, burial, and funeral quilts, especially, because I do believe in the power and the role that quilts have to play in grieving and loss and memory. And so I want that to be accessible for anybody that wants that in their life, So I kind of view the income pie this way, that a lot of it is the quilts, but the creative community, Quilting Nook, subsidizes the quilting work I do, the almost counseling work, if you will, like there's a lot of people I can say, this memory quilt throw $2,000, they don't blink an eye. And I really appreciate that. But then there's other people for whom even $500 would be a lot of money for the same quilt. And so how do you make all of that work? How do you get those quilts into the homes they need to be in? I don't know.
Next, I'd like to listen to our 2009 interview with Carolyn Crump as she reflects on making the transition to professional quilt maker. She was interviewed by Karen Musgrave.
Are you concerned about doing this full time? Are you confident?
Yes, I am. I never been one to worry about a lot of things. I put money up for a rainy day. I've always been the type that I'll just jump in and do something. It kind of worries me at first because I have a daughter in college, who's 21, and I have two daughters in high school. One's in 11th grade and one in the 10th grade. But I just realized if I don't start now, the way the economy is going, would I be able to send them the other two to college? What would happen to us staying on the job? I mean, I was in the newspaper field. You know what's happening to newspaper with the internet.
Mm-hmm.
It won't be long before that is, gone. And I realized that with everything going and the cutbacks on the job, and it was just time for me to, just start it. I don't mind taking a chance in life. I'm very confident in myself, and I just have a lot of faith. And I really thought it was time that, for me to start doing it full time.
So here Carolyn is talking about how, she made that leap where she realized she could cultivate enough clients, and exactly kind of where you're at right now, Zach, of making that leap, taking what really is a risk, of course, quitting the day job and transitioning into a full-time career as a quilt maker. Tell us about how you made that decision and your plan for the work, which I assume does include a little bit of more detail about the Quilting Nook that we'd like to hear about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I knew I've had a 5-year plan for a while, for more than 5 years, but I knew that I'd be leaving teaching. I'd been teaching in public high schools, both in New York and North Carolina, for 18 years. And I've known for the last several years that it was time to hop out, but I just wasn't sure on the pathway forward. And I was talking to an end of life doula, actually, who said, Zach, I'm on Patreon. This is not my full income, but it's pretty nice. You might want to think about it. And I was like, well, man, you're probably right. Let me look at it. And so that would have been early last summer. So maybe June. I mean, I probably started thinking about it in May and opened it in June. And Patreon receives such warm, enthusiastic support that I was just kind of blown away. Like I thought that I had a certain dollar amount in mind. I was like, okay, so if I make this dollar amount, I'll quit teaching, you know. And I didn't make it by month 1, but I did make it by month 2, which felt pretty cool. But what I began to realize over time was that as fast as we were growing, I was refining my vision for what I wanted this creative community to be. And so I was kind of cobbling together all these different platforms to make that creative community happen. This kind of Frankenstein patchwork method, I suppose. And that's because Patreon, for anybody who's considering, Patreon's good at a lot of things. One, it's got brand recognition. A lot of people know Patreon. 2, it's built for creators like myself to be able to share content with people that like what they're making. For me, the problem became that I wanted it to be more than just a one-directional, let me share what I'm doing with you, right? I was much more interested in the cross-pollination that I was seeing happening in my cohorts, because one of the parts of this creative community is this idea of the creative cohort. And so anybody can join at a certain level and join the Quilting Nook. You can get in, you can share, you can post, you can attend the workshops, the visiting artist series, have all the resources and Zach zines you want. And if you're interested in kind of a more intimate small group experience, well, that's the cohort. And what I was seeing happening in those cohorts, there's only like 8 people in them, and we meet once a month, and they keep in touch with each other throughout the month. I was seeing that somebody would try some new technique one month, and by the time the meeting rolled around for the next month, another person in the cohort was putting a spin on that. And it was so cool to see how people were inspiring each other. It wasn't just me, right, up on a pedestal doling out inspiration. It was the community inspiring the community. And I was like, okay, so if that's happening so powerfully in these small cohorts of 8 people, how can I envision this platform in a way that'll help that facilitate that for more people, no matter what level they're plugging in at, And about that time that I was beginning to notice the limitations of my Frankenstein Patreon platform, a friend of mine, Felicia Simple from Soulcraft down in Melbourne, she emailed me out of the blue and she said, Zach, feel free to disregard this unsolicited advice, but I see what you're doing on Patreon, and I think Mighty Networks is the platform for what you want to do. And what I like about Mighty Networks is that it is kind of they give you a template of a platform, and then the host can make it whatever they want. It's structured a lot like social media we're used to, like Facebook. So, you can post and comment and you can share, and there's special chats for special things, and there's places for resources to, like a little resource library. Like, it's just all very organized and flows. There's a calendar there for special events that pop up, So it's what I like about it is it has everything I need under one roof. So it was able to replace about 5 different other apps and platforms I was using. And it's been a big transition. So that's been happening over the last couple of weeks.
I'd like to next share a clip from Judy Haas's 2008 interview, also conducted by Karen Musgrave. Here she's discussing the challenges of work-life balance.
Been pursuing this as a career or even as something you really enjoy and that you'd like to be participating largely, kind of getting a niche for yourself in some ways. I think that's very difficult for professional quilters, deciding what that is, and then just finding the time to work on it. You know, when you're that's not just what you're doing. There's always these interferences, dogs, and you know, family members, other obligations. I think that's always going to be a challenge for women.
She's speaking, I think, of that distinct challenge many women face, particularly creating that balance between family and career. What do you like, or how do you feel about being your own boss? Pros, cons, challenges, joys that you are experiencing?
Well, Yannick, haven't been my own boss now for 6 whole weeks. I have a wealth of information to draw on. But I will say, I can give you the fresh impressions, right? I will tell you that I think I am constitutionally cut out to be my own boss. It feels so good. Like this morning, for example, I roll over in bed and it's raining cats and dogs outside. And I was just like, oh, I don't have to go to work today, right? I can stay inside and I can sew, which is now the work. But I don't have to hop on my bike and bike into school like I would have just a few weeks ago. I love being able to dedicate my time and my energy to things that feel meaningful to me. I like being able to set my own hours. I have enjoyed experimenting with daily routine. Like, what does Zak's work day look like? I don't know. I think in the ideal day, if there is such a thing like that, it would be sewing in the morning and then kind of the business work in the afternoon. I like what Mary Oliver said about writing poetry. She said that she saved the best part of herself for the best part of her day, which was for her the mornings, and that's true for me too.
So I was just reading about you in People magazine, of course. Your quilt making has recently played a role at the Met Gala, as many of our listeners may have already heard. So this was obviously a big deal and very exciting. Can you tell us about this project?
I'm sitting around on my phone, as I often do one day on Instagram, and I get this private message from this private account who sends me this poorly lit photo of a vintage puff quilt and just says, "Can you make this?" No hi, no how you doing, no nothing. And I look at that quilt and I'm like, nope, I'm too busy. So I write them back, real nice. I'm like, oh, thank you so much, but my project calendar is full. I can recommend somebody if you'd like. And they write back, that would be great. It's for the Met. And I was like, oh, your horses. What's going on here? This is bigger than I realized. And so come to find out that there is a designer in LA, Eli Russell Lynette, who was commissioned by A$AP Rocky, boyfriend of Rihanna, for those who might not recognize the name. And Rocky wanted a garment, a quilt, to wear to the annual fundraiser at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, the Met Gala. And what they wanted was to take this vintage quilt. The original intention was to remake the vintage puff quilt. And I think what happened is we got closer and closer to time. We ran out of time. And so then we stayed with the vintage quilt, and I designed a back for it. I designed the red side, which I think this was a better move in 2 ways, if you're asking me. One, I don't got to tell the folks listening to this that vintage quilts have their own kind of magic. And there's no way you can reproduce the way certain fabrics have faded in certain places, and the way certain polyfill has smushed down in certain places, right? Like, they just have their own history that you can't recreate. And so I think it was a smart move for that reason. 2, doing the red side of the quilt, I had nearly full artistic license to do what I wanted to do. My directives were layers and chaos. They gave me all the red fabrics, and I just made it look layered and chaotic. And that's what I did. And so for anybody that saw the Met Gala, probably saw, Rocky and Rihanna showing up 2 hours late, but whatever. Nearly gave me a heart attack. I thought they weren't going to walk. And they showed up, and they're the only ones on the stairs because everybody else is indoors already whining, dining, and partying. And Rihanna and Rocky are taking their time, walking up the stairs. Rocky's all wrapped up in the quilt so that the vintage side is out. All you see is the vintage side. And then he gets to the top of the stairs and he throws his arms open, revealing the red side and dropping it onto the ground. It was a very dramatic moment.
Yeah.
And what I love, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, but what I love about that moment is that the carpet of the Met Gala wasn't technically a red carpet, even though we called it that. It was white because they had this very white theme happening. And so when Rocky did that and he laid the quilt down in such a way that the red side was up, it was kind of like he was making his own piece of red carpet. And I just thought was like, that's just so powerful. That was just such a cool image. And I mean, Anna Wintour herself, the chief editor of Vogue magazine, opening up the Met Gala, was, you know, giving her benediction, her opening comments. And she said that American fashion is patchwork. And she said that because the theme for the Met Gala this year was American legacy or something along those lines. But then here comes A$AP Rocky wearing perhaps the most iconic form of American textiles, a quilt. And a quilt is just so democratic in the little d, you know, like almost everybody's got a quilt in their homes and almost everybody has some kind of firsthand experience with a quilt. And so there's just this way of talking about what America is and what America can be that I see in this moment when I see Rocky walking up those steps into the Metropolitan Museum, wearing the quilt and then opening up to reveal the red carpet that he himself brought to the event.
So a woman identified the quilt and said, this was my grandmother or my great grandmother made this, and we'd taken it to a thrift store. Is this all part of the actual legend of this event?
This is legend come life. I mean, it was amazing because think about, I mean, and I don't need to tell somebody who studies quilt history that how many anonymous quilts there are out there that we have entirely lost their provenance, their origin, their story, right? And here's an example, thanks to the power of social media, of quilts being reconnected with their source.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. So what was interesting to me is right after the Met Gala, there were a few people, I'd say 3 or 4, who reached out to me or the designer saying, oh, I made this quilt. And they sent me pictures. And turns out McCall's had a pattern, 1978, in which not only was it how to make a puff quilt, but it must have been like a package deal or something that came with fabric because they all looked identical.
Huh.
They were all the same yellow, brown, green, red calicos, right?
And there's a particular kind of stripe pattern through the puffs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we'd seen a few of those. So we're like, okay, there's some of those quilts floating around out there. But then in steps Sarah from LA, well, outside LA somewhere, I've forgotten where. And Sarah says, yeah, my great grandma made that quilt. Here's a picture of it on our bed. And I'm like, well, can you describe it for me a little bit? And she was able to describe the border, which was not pictured in the quilting and the picture, excuse me. But the border was one of the things that was variable from one quilt to the next. So she was able to describe accurately the border and the backing. And then she says, oh yeah, we just donated to a thrift shop in LA about, you know, X number of months ago. And I was like, okay, this is probably it. I think this is where this quilt came from. And she said that her grandma Mary was one of the least met people that you would ever meet, right? So just thinking that her great grandma would have been absolutely floored to see her work at an event like that. She was also able to explain to me why this quilt was so heavy, because I weighed this quilt and it was 16 pounds. And she says, well, my grandmother, her daughter, was a sleepwalker when she was a kid. So this was like the original, what do you call it? Thunder blankets or whatever? Like you put thunder jackets that you put on dogs. Weighted blankets. We call them weighted blankets.
Yeah.
This quilt was designed to keep a small child in bed, and it worked, you know? So I'm like, that makes sense. And we could have never known that any other way. Eli asked Sarah to bring something with her great grandma's signature on, and they found an old driver's license. And Eli got that scanned in and is having Mary's signature embroidered into the quilt as a recognition of the role that she played. Isn't that brilliant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. Oh, what a what a nice kind of bow on that whole experience. Oh, that's
Totally.
beautiful. And certainly that fits our mission at the Quilt Alliance. We are tired of anonymous quilts, and we want every quilt to be labeled. And I love that this quilt that Asa Rocky wore to the Met will have not just your, and this is all part of the quilt making tradition, the layers, the bricolage of taking bits and pieces of this and that. This is what you've created, and it means a lot. I love that you also have the maker of the original quilt to attribute and sign on this object.
Isn't
as
that
well.
great?
Well, that is a wonderful note to end our conversation on, Zak, and congratulations on that piece. And it's a wonderful to have, a quilt in the spotlight in that way. And it's fantastic that you were able to be involved in the whole process.
Yeah, I heard from so many people that it felt like a victory for all quilters everywhere. And I'm like, I am so happy that it feels that way for folks, because it really is. I mean, there's a reason we love quilts.
Yep.
And to see a quilt honored like that in a special place like the red carpet of the Met Gala, it did feel like a personal victory in many ways for many people. And I was really glad to have a hand in that.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of Running Stitch on Going Pro. And we loved hearing from you, Zak. And also welcome to our little exclusive club of younger quilt makers.
Hey, thank you so much, Yannicka.
Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast, is a project of the Quilt Alliance, a member-supported national nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing the stories of quilts and quilt makers. Running Stitch is hosted and written by me, Yannicka Smucker, and I serve as co-producer with QSOS project manager Emma Parker, with support from Quilt Alliance executive director Amy Milne. This podcast is generously funded by the Robert and Artist James Foundation. QSOS oral history interviews are archived with our partners, the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and at the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. You can listen to full interviews and see photos of quilts at our website, qsos.quiltalliance.org. Running Stitch features music by Chris Eselgroth, accompanied by a singer featherweight, and Amy's Best Sewing Shears.